Greetings, I'm Reverend Yue McCormick, Head Minister of Enyuzan, Perfect Dragon Mountain, Shinganji, True Vow Temple, of the Nichiren Shu Sangha of the San Francisco Bay Area. In this presentation in 4 parts, it is my goal to cover those things about the teachings of Nichiren Shonin that Nichiren Shu expects its clergy to know. I feel that this might also be of interest to dedicated lay practitioners as well as those who are curious about Nichiren Buddhism and would like to know more about its founder. In addition to the history and teachings of Nichiren Buddhism, I have also drawn upon material from the 7-volume series, Writings of Nichiren Shonin, published by the Nichiren Shu Overseas Propagation and Promotion Association. I will cite these volumes with the initials WNS, the volume number and page number of that volume. I also provide citations from corresponding passages, when there are any, in the Writings of Nichiren Daishonin, which is in 2 volumes. I will cite these volumes with the initials WND and then the volume and page number. I cite these for the purpose of comparison with the Nichiren Shu translations and on those occasions when they provide the only English translation widely available. Much of the information in these presentations come from the following sources: the genealogical chart of the Buddha's lifetime teachings in 5 periods, which is in WNS 3, pages 238 to 250. The diagram of the 5 periods of the Buddha's lifetime teachings in WND 2, pages 238 to 243. And with the same name, diagram of the 5 periods of the Buddha's lifetime teachings, WND 2, pages 736 to 739. And the rooster diagram of the 5 periods of the Buddha's lifetime teachings, WND 2, pages 1035 to 1042. This is the one that corresponds to the Nichiren Shu translation. Also, a guide to the Tiantai Fourfold Teachings and Tiantai Lotus Texts, published by the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai, pages 151 to 210. I will note that material appearing in dark red rather than black is material that is either not covered or not covered in detail in the book History and Teachings in Nichiren Buddhism, published by the Nichiren Shu Text Editorial Committee. This is material that I personally feel is important for Nichiren Buddhist practitioners to be familiar with, especially clergy and lay teachers. Now let's begin the second of the 4 parts. Now that we have reviewed some of the Tiantai teachings that had a major impact on Nichiren Shonin's own teaching, let us look at how he used these teachings to prove the importance of the Lotus Sutra for his own time and place, 13th century Japan. In October of 1262, during his exile to the Izu Peninsula, Nichiren wrote his Treatise on the Teaching Capacity, Time, and Country, Kyōki-ji Koku Sho, in which he set forth his 5 guidelines or 5 principles for propagation, in Japanese Gogi or Goko. This is in WNS 3, pages 96 to 104, or WND 1, pages 48 to 53. The first is to understand the proper teaching, which Nichiren Shonin had concluded was the Lotus Sutra based on the Tiantai comparative classification of doctrines and the statements made by the Buddha in the Infinite Meaning Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. As we shall see, Nichiren Shonin also set forth his own system of evaluating teachings in his 5 comparisons and 4 sets of 3 parts, in order to make it even clearer that it is the Lotus Sutra, and most especially the practice of the Odaimoku, the 5 or 7 characters of the sacred title of the Lotus Sutra, that is Shakyamuni Buddha's most important teaching for us to practice. We will be looking over the 5 comparisons in the 4 sets of 3 parts shortly. Second is that a teacher should know the capacity of those being taught. One should consider whether people have the ability to understand and practice the Dharma, or whether they are uneducated and dull and lack any kind of self-discipline or sense of ethics. Nichiren Shonin concluded that the people of his day were not only dull and ignorant, but also slanderers, who refused to believe the Buddha's message in the Lotus Sutra. For that reason, he believed that the pre-Lotus Sutras were incapable of helping such incorrigible people, that teaching the other sutras would only confirm their rejection of the Lotus Sutra, and that at least by denouncing the false teachings and upholding the Lotus Sutra, one could sow the seed of Buddhahood in the depths of people's minds, even if they initially rejected it. The third is to know the correct time for specific teachings. Nichiren Shonin and his contemporaries believed that the first 1,000 years after the final nirvana of Shakyamuni Buddha was the former age of the true Dharma, when it was possible to practice all of the Buddha's teachings and attain enlightenment. The next millennia would be the age of the semblance Dharma, wherein the people might still practice and study Buddhism, but would no longer attain enlightenment in their lifetimes. The latter age of the degeneration of the Dharma would follow those 2,000 years and in the latter age, the true spirit of Buddhism would be forgotten, and eventually Buddhism itself would disappear. Nichiren Shonin and many of his contemporaries believed this latter age had begun in the year 1052, because they believed the Buddha had entered final nirvana in 949 BCE. Nichiren Shonin believed that the Lotus Sutra had been taught especially for the people of the latter age based on several statements in the Lotus Sutra, and that the Odaimoku was the teaching that was especially beneficial for sowing the seed of Buddhahood during such a benighted time when people were lacking in wisdom and virtue. Nichiren Shonin placed so much importance on the time that one of his 5 major writings on the selection of the time, Senjisho, focuses specifically on the question of whether now is the right time to propagate the Odaimoku of the Lotus Sutra. We now place the dates of the Buddha's birth and final nirvana hundreds of years later, but the principle of the time should not be taken as simply about chronology, but about the quality of the times. In other words, are we living in a time of peace and prosperity, of wise rulers and an educated and benevolent populace? Or are we living in a time of war, epidemics, economic and ecological disasters, and vicious hate-mongering between nationalities, genders, ethnicities, religions, political parties, and so on? Is now a time when people look for wise teachers so they can educate themselves and discern the true nature of reality and arouse compassion for others? Or is it a time when even secular education is impossible for many, or devalued, and everyone believes that they can be their own expert and have their own facts, so that there are no longer any common values or even a common reality? The fourth is to know the characteristics of the country. Is it a country where Buddhism has already been introduced? And if so, what kind of Buddhism has spread, Hinayana or Mahayana? Nichiren Shonin believed that Japan had affinities for the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and that to resort to other sutras would be a regression. In the US, it can be said that the Lotus Sutra was first introduced, though in a partial and garbled form, as early as 1844. In other ways, we are very much a non-Buddhist country, even a non-religious country, and those forms of religion that are in the public sphere are more often than not motivated by fear and hatred, ethnocentrism and nationalism. It might with justification be said that other Buddhist teachings would be lost on such ignorant and benighted people, and that only by immediately sowing the seed of Buddhahood through confronting them with the Odaimoku can a difference be made in the karma of such incorrigible people living in a culture and an age so far removed from that of Shakyamuni Buddha. Finally, the 5th criteria is the sequence of propagation, which means that if the provisional teachings have already been taught, then it is time to teach the sutra they are meant to prepare people for, the Lotus Sutra. Of course, in medieval Japan, Nichiren believed that provisional forms of Buddhism had already gained wide support, and it was long past time to propagate the Odaimoku of the Lotus Sutra. In the English-speaking world, the pre-Mahayana teachings have been available since the end of the 19th century, and the major Mahayana sutras were translated in the mid-20th century. Buddhist teachers from many Asian countries have propagated the pre-Lotus Sutra teachings throughout the world, so that those who make the effort to seek the Buddha Dharma have the resources available to quickly learn about the teachings. Versions of the Lotus Sutra have been available in translation since the end of the 19th century as well, and the practice of the Odaimoku spread throughout the world in the latter half of the 20th century. It certainly seems as though the sequence has been fulfilled, and that the groundwork has been laid for the propagation of the Lotus Sutra itself. In Nichiren Shu, it is taught that the 5th criteria switched from knowing the sequence to knowing the right teacher or master. As Zeiho Miwa writes, quote, "Once the right teaching was determined, the precondition or sequence of propagation was no longer needed. A new item then needs to replace it. This would be the master who propagates the right teachings." Nichiren Shonin found the timing of the transition from the sequence to the master after the Tatsunokuchi persecution in the 8th year of the Bunei era, 1271. Nichiren Shonin recognized himself as a practitioner of the Lotus Sutra, in Japanese, Hokkekyo no Gyoja. That's from the History and Teachings of Nichiren Buddhism, page 189. We will return to this idea that Nichiren Shonin was especially given the mission to propagate the Lotus Sutra by the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha at the end of the 3rd part of this presentation. Earlier we asked, why did Nichiren Shonin think that Shakyamuni Buddha was the one to be revered above all others, and that the Lotus Sutra fully revealed the true meaning of his teachings? Having accepted the Tiantai system of doctrinal classification and found proof texts in the sutras, we can begin to understand why Nichiren Shonin was convinced that the Lotus Sutra was indeed the king of sutras. But why should Buddhism be accepted as superior to other teachings? And what exactly is the most profound and important teaching of the Buddha in Nichiren Shonin's view? Here are the 5 comparisons, in Japanese Goju Sotai, derived from 2 of Nichiren's 5 major writings, may help us to better understand Nichiren's convictions. The first 4 comparisons can be found in On the Opening of the Eyes, Kaimokusho, whereas the 5th comparison is made more explicit in On the Contemplation of the Mind and the Focus of Devotion. The first comparison is between the inner way, meaning Buddhism, and the outer way, meaning non-Buddhism. From a Buddhist point of view, other teachings tend to fall into either the extreme of nihilism or the extreme of eternalism. Nihilism is the view that there is no afterlife, and that the causes we make, wholesome or unwholesome, are of no lasting consequence and will have no repercussions after death, at least to us. Eternalism is the view that the causes we make do not matter, as they cannot fundamentally change things, because our fate is predetermined, for better or worse, by forces outside of our control, such as fate or God. Nichiren Shonin trusted that Shakyamuni Buddha had actually awakened to the truth that while there may be no self-nature, there is a process of rebirth operating according to the law of cause and effect, which is to say that there is a continuity of causes and conditions that unfold over countless lifetimes. This means that we ourselves determine our own fate through our karma or actions, and that suffering is not inevitable, while liberation is always possible. The second comparison is between the Mahayana and the Hinayana. In East Asian Buddhism, Hinayana is believed to be a form of Buddhism where people are taught not to attain or not to aim for Buddhahood, unsurpassed perfect and complete awakening, but for a lesser form of liberation whereby they can exit the cycle of rebirth and thereby reduce the body to ashes and annihilate consciousness upon death. Mahayana is better because it encourages people not to escape from life, but to remain compassionately engaged with the world and to strive for the state of Buddhahood, whereby one can help liberate all beings from suffering. The third comparison is between the True Sutra, i.e. the Lotus Sutra, and the Provisional Sutras, i.e. the prior sutras. The Lotus Sutra is deemed true because it alone guarantees that all beings have the ability to awaken to and express Buddhahood. Other sutras and the teachings based on them seem to limit who could attain Buddhahood. Some said or implied that women could not, or that certain people were too ignorant or evil to ever attain Buddhahood in their present or any other lifetime, or that some people were bereft of the seed of Buddhahood and had to settle for lesser goals. For instance, according to the Dharma Characteristics School, beings have one of 5 natures. Some have a nature only for the Bodhisattva vehicle, who can attain Buddhahood. Some have an indeterminate nature whereby they can attain the goal of any of the 3 vehicles. The vehicle for voice hearers to become arhats and escape rebirth, the vehicle for privately awakened ones to escape rebirth, or the Bodhisattva vehicle to attain Buddhahood. Third, some have a nature only for the privately awakened one vehicle. Fourth, some have a nature only for the voice hearer vehicle. And fifth, some have an incorrigible nature that can never attain any kind of liberation from suffering. The Lotus Sutra, however, teaches the one vehicle whereby it is asserted that all the Buddha's teachings are for the sake of enabling all beings to attain Buddhahood without exception. The fourth comparison is between the original gate and the trace gate of the Lotus Sutra. According to Tiantai exegesis, the first half of the Lotus Sutra is called the trace gate and was taught by Shakyamuni Buddha, appearing as a historical person who was teaching his disciples the one vehicle, so that even the adherents of the 2 vehicles could attain Buddhahood, in Japanese Nijo Sabutsu, though this attainment would be in a future lifetime on other worlds. Going by the trace gate teaching, one can attain Buddhahood in principle in the future, and it is assumed that, like the historical Shakyamuni Buddha, one must spend eons of lifetimes accumulating wisdom and merit before attaining Buddhahood. According to the trace gate, there were Buddhas in the past, there will be Buddhas in the future, and there are Buddhas in other worlds, and in theory, we can someday attain Buddhahood ourselves. However, in the latter half of the Lotus Sutra called the Original Gate, Shakyamuni Buddha reveals that he attained Buddhahood in the remotest past, in Japanese Kuan Jitsujo, which means that his Buddhahood has no quantifiable beginning or end, and that this world is his Pure Land, which likewise has no beginning or end. In actuality, according to the Original Gate, we are already living in the Pure Land presided over by the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha, who is always trying to teach us to quickly attain Buddhahood. The fifth comparison is between the gate of comparative classification of the teachings, in Japanese Kyohan, and the contemplation of the mind, Japanese kanjin. The comparative classification of teachings or doctrines led to the conclusion that in the original gate is contained the ultimate teaching of the Buddha, which Great Master Tiantai expressed in terms of the concept of the 3,000 worlds in a single thought moment, Japanese Ichinen Sanzen, as explained in the last part of this presentation. It basically means that all of reality, including Buddhahood, is present in every thought moment. However, it does us no good if that is merely a doctrinal principle to learn and give credence to, and not something that we are able to directly perceive in our lives through contemplative practice. Nichiren and Shonin believe that the practice of chanting the Odaimogu, the act of expressing joyful confidence in the wonderful Dharma, was the right way of contemplating the mind in order to actually observe for ourselves the deep inner meaning of the original gate of the Lotus Sutra, the actuality of the 3,000 realms in every thought moment. Nichiren and Shonin believe that all the Buddha's teachings led to this true contemplation of the mind to discern the message hidden in the depths of chapter 16, expressed doctrinally as a principle of the 3,000 realms in a single thought moment, and in actual practice as a chanting of the Odaimoku, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. As mentioned previously in his treatise on the contemplation of the mind and the focus of devotion, Nichiren and Shonin made a deeper investigation into the comparison between the Buddha's teachings and the practice of contemplating the mind. One way in which he does this is by explaining the 4 sets of 3 parts. The first set of 3 parts examines the lifetime teachings of the Shakyamuni Buddha. The first part is a preface or introduction to his main teachings, which consists of all the sutras beginning with the Flower Garland Sutra all the way up to and including the larger Prajna Sutra. The second part, or main discourse, consists of the threefold Lotus Sutra, meaning the Infinite Meaning Sutra, the Lotus Sutra itself, and the contemplation of the Universal Sage Bodhisattva Sutra. The third part, or transmission, consists of just the Nirvana Sutra. The second set of 3 parts examines just the threefold Lotus Sutra as a single sutra. In this set, the preface consists of the Infinite Meaning Sutra and chapter 1 of the Lotus Sutra. The main discourse consists of chapters 2 through the first half of chapter 17. The transmission consists of the latter half of chapter 17 through the end of the Lotus Sutra and includes the contemplation of the Universal Sage Bodhisattva Sutra. The third set of 3 parts actually comprises 2 sets of 3, so one should actually speak of 2 gates of the sutra in 6 parts. The first gate is the Trace Gate, wherein the preface consists of the Infinite Meaning Sutra in chapter 1 of the Lotus Sutra. The main discourse consists of chapters 2 through 9, wherein the one vehicle is taught. The transmission consists of chapters 10 through 14. Next is the original gate, of which the preface is the first half of chapter 15, wherein the appearance of the Bodhisattvas from underground raise questions about the lifespan of Shakyamuni Buddha. The main discourse consists of the latter half of chapter 15, all of 16, and the first half of chapter 17, wherein the original Shakyamuni Buddha who attained Buddhahood in the remotest past is revealed. The transmission consists of the latter half of chapter 17 through to chapter 28 of the Lotus Sutra and the contemplation of the Universal Sage Bodhisattva Sutra. Here we see a narrowing down of what is primary. Only in the 1 chapter and 2 half chapters of the main discourse of the original gate is it revealed that Buddhahood is not just something someone else realized in the past or something that can only be realized in the future, but is something ongoing, present, and without a substantial beginning or end. Again, Nichiren and Shonin believe that Great Master Tiantai expressed the reality of Buddhahood in its immanence and immediacy in terms of the principle of the 3,000 realms in a single thought moment. The 4th set of parts, or 5th set, if one counts the 3 parts of the Trace Gate as the 3rd and the 3 parts of the original gate as a 4th set, examines the original Dharma, or true Dharma. This set only has 2 parts, the preface and the main discourse. Nichiren Shonin explains as follows, quote, "There is another triple division culminating in the original gate. Innumerable sutras beginning with the Lotus Sutra expounded during the time of the ancient great universal wisdom Buddha, those preached by Shakyamuni Buddha during 50-some years of his lifetime, including the Flower Garland Sutra, 14 chapters of the Trace Gate of the Lotus Sutra, and the Nirvana Sutra, as well as those preached by Buddhas in the worlds of in the worlds, in the universe, in the past, at present, and in the future, are the preface to the great Dharma of 5 characters hidden in the lines of the 16th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the lifespan of the Buddha. And that's in WNS2, page 152, or WND1, pages 368 to 369. Nichiren Shonin calls Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching of the main discourse of the original gate the culmination of the Buddhism of the harvest, because he taught it for the sake of those who had been given the seed of Buddhahood by hearing the Lotus Sutra in the past, and were finally ready to bring that seed to fruition. The 5 characters of the Odaimoku, hidden in the depths of chapter 16, are the practice of the Buddhism of sowing, specifically for those in the present age. He says, quote, "The teaching of the original gate during the lifetime of Shakyamuni Buddha and that which would spread in the beginning of the latter age are likewise absolutely perfect. However, the former is for attaining enlightenment, whereas the latter is for sowing the seed of Buddhahood. While the former is crystallized in the 16th chapter, the lifespan of the Buddha, with half a chapter each preceding and following it, the latter is solely embodied in the 5 characters of Myoho, Renge, and Kyo, the title of the Lotus Sutra." End quote. That passage is from WNS2, page 154, or WND1, page 370. This means that the practice of Odaimoku, the act of expressing one's joyful confidence in the message of the original gate of the Lotus Sutra, is metaphorically sowing the seed of Buddhahood in our own lives and in the lives of others. This seed contains all the merit and virtue of the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha. Referring back to the 5 comparisons, to sow the seed of Buddhahood through Odaimoku practice here and now is a contemplation practice that is superior to the doctrinal teaching of the main discourse of the original gate of the Lotus Sutra in the past, which was for those who already practiced a long time and needed to hear the Lotus Sutra once again to remember and bring their own seeds to fruition. Why should sowing be superior to fruition or harvest? Because it is the sowing here and now that matters. The fruition of the past is past, and the fruition of Buddhahood, that is to say the actual activity of a Buddha, depends upon this act of sowing, and in fact is manifest in the act of sowing. Here is what Nichiren Shonin said about the former teaching of the 3,000 realms in a single thought moment and the practice of Odaimoku. Quote, "They, however, merely reasoned in the abstract that 3,000 realms in a single thought moment are contained in the minds of the unenlightened. They did not practice and have others practice the actual way of realizing it, reciting and upholding the 5 characters of Myoho, Renge, and Kyo, and revering the focus of devotion as revealed in the original gate of the Lotus Sutra." That passage is from WNS2, page 161, though I have adapted it, and WND1, page 375. With that, I bring the second part of this 4-part presentation of teachings of Nichiren Shonin to a close. I hope that this presentation was helpful and informative and will help to enrich your faith in and practice of Nichiren Buddhism.